is found. In the west of England, in a part of the country called Somerset, there lived a gentleman whose name was Allworthy. He might be called the favourite of both nature and fortune, because nature had given him the gifts of good health, good sense, and a kind heart, and fortune had made him one of the richest landowners in that part of England. In his youth, this gentleman had married a good, beautiful woman. They had 3 children, all of whom died young, and about 5 years before this story begins, his wife also died. He loved her still, and sometimes said that he was waiting to join her after death. He now lived in the country most of the time with his sister, Miss Bridget Allworthy. This lady was now past the age of 30. She was a very good woman who often thanked God she was not beautiful, because she believed that beauty led women into wicked ways. Now, reader, as Mr. Allworthy had a large fortune, a good heart, and no family, you may think that he lived an honest life, gave to the poor, built a hospital, and died a rich man. It is true that he did many of these things, but they are not the reason for this story. Something much more extraordinary happened. One evening, Mr. Allworthy came back to his house very late and very tired. He had been away in London on business for several months. After a light supper with his sister, he went to bed. First, he spent some time on his knees, praying to God, and then he pulled back the bedclothes. To his great surprise, he saw a baby lying in his bed in a sweet, deep sleep. He stood for some time, looking at its innocent beauty, and then rang his bell to call his elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Deborah Wilkins. When Mrs. Wilkins saw the child, she cried out, "My good sir, what shall we do?" Mr. Allworthy answered that she must take care of the child that evening, and in the morning he would give orders to find a nurse for it. "Yes, sir," said Mrs. Wilkins, "and I hope you will give orders to send its wicked mother to prison for doing this." "In leaving the baby here, Deborah," said Mr. Allworthy, "I suppose the poor woman has tried to provide a good home for her child, and I am very glad she has not done worse." "But, sir," cried Mrs. Wilkins, "why should you take care of the child? Why not put it in a basket and leave it at the church door? If you keep it, people may think that you are the father." But Mr. Allworthy did not hear her. He now had one of his fingers in the sweet child's hand, and was smiling at it gently. So Mrs. Wilkins took the child to her room, and Mr. Allworthy went to bed and slept well until morning. Mr. Allworthy's house stood on a hill and had a charming view of the valley beneath. To the right of the valley were several villages, and to the left a great park. Beyond the park, the country gradually rose into a range of wild mountains, the tops of which were above the clouds. The house was very noble. It was surrounded by a fine garden, with old oak trees and a stream that flowed down to a lake at the bottom of the hill. From every room at the front of the house you could see the lake, and a river that passed for several miles through woods and fields till it emptied itself into the sea. It was now the middle of May, and as Mr. Allworthy stood watching the sun rise over this lovely view, Miss Bridget Allworthy rang her bell and called him to breakfast. When she had poured the tea, Mr. Allworthy told his sister he had a present for her. She thanked him. This was not unusual, as he often gave her new clothes and jewellery to wear. Imagine her surprise when Mrs. Wilkins produced the baby. Miss Bridget was silent until her brother had told her the whole story. He ended by saying that he had decided to take care of the child and bring it up as his own. Miss Bridget looked kindly at the child and told her brother she admired his generosity. He was a good man. However, she was less kind about the poor, unknown mother, whom she called every bad name she could think of. The next step was to discover who the mother was. Mr. Allworthy, leaving this task to his housekeeper and the child to his sister, left the room. Mrs. Wilkins waited for a sign from Miss Bridget. Did she really agree with her brother? Miss Bridget looked for some time at the child as it lay asleep in Mrs. Wilkins's lap, then gave it a big kiss, exclaiming about its beauty and innocence. When Mrs. Wilkins saw this, she too started squeezing and kissing the baby, and cried out, "Oh, the dear little child, the dear, sweet, pretty child! He is as fine a boy as I have ever seen." Then Miss Bridget gave orders for the servants to get a very good room in the house ready for the child, and to provide him with everything he needed. She was as generous as if he had been a child of her own. Later that day, Mrs. Wilkins went to the village nearby to ask questions about the abandoned child. She soon decided that the most likely mother was Jenny Jones. Jenny Jones was a poor young girl from the village who had lived as a servant with a schoolmaster and his wife for several years. She had a quick mind and a desire to learn, so the schoolmaster had helped to educate her. Jenny became proud of her learning, and when she returned to the village, she behaved in a superior way, which her neighbours hated. They also noticed that Jenny had often been to Mr. Allworthy's house. She had nursed Miss Bridget in a recent illness, and had sat up many nights looking after her. Indeed, Mrs. Wilkins herself had seen Jenny at the house the very day before Mr. Allworthy's return. She hurried back to the house to tell Mr. Allworthy her suspicions. Mr. Allworthy called Jenny to the house. She confessed freely to being the baby's mother, but she refused to name the father. "I thank you, sir, for your kindness to my poor, helpless child," she said. "He is innocent, and I hope he will live to be grateful for your generosity. But, sir, on my knees, I must ask you not to insist on finding out the name of his father. I have sworn before God not to tell anyone his name now, but I promise that one day you will know." Mr. Allworthy fully believed all that Jenny told him, and sent her away with the promise that he would not send her to prison, but would help her to lead a better life. "She was lucky," said one neighbour, when Jenny returned to the village. A second cried, "See what it is to be a favourite." A third, "It's because she has education." Soon, through the care and goodness of Mr. Allworthy, Jenny left the village, and there was more gossip. The villagers decided that Mr. Allworthy was the baby's father, and began to feel sorry for Jenny Jones. Some even said he had been cruel to send her away, but the good Mr. Allworthy did not listen. Baby Jones stayed in his house, and was given Mr. Allworthy's first name, which was Thomas. And now we must leave Jenny Jones and little Tom Jones for a while, as we have much more important things to tell. Chapter 2. The Shame of Mr. Partridge. Mr. Allworthy's house and his heart were open to all men, but particularly to men of learning. Though he had not had the advantage of a good education, he had made up for this through wide reading and conversation. Well-educated men were always welcome at his table. One guest of this kind was Captain Blifil. This gentleman was about 35 years of age. After a good education, he had joined the King's army, but recently he had left the army and had come to Somerset to live a quiet country life. He liked to study the Bible. Miss Bridget had read many books about religion, and she often talked to the captain on this subject. Her conversation was so pure, her looks so wise, and her manner so serious, that she seemed like a saint. Yet soon the captain could see that she was falling in love with him. Everyone will fall in love once in their lives, and there is no particular age for this. But at Miss Bridget's age, love is serious and steady. It was not the captain's body, which was big and rough, nor his face, which was covered up to his eyes by a black beard, but his conversation, which charmed her. As soon as the captain saw this, he returned her affections. To be plain, he was already in love with Mr. Allworthy's house, gardens, villages, and farms. His sister was no beauty, but as Mr. Allworthy had no son, the captain would marry Miss Bridget, even if she was the ugliest woman in the world. And in less than a month, he did just that. Mr. Allworthy did not object to the marriage. "My sister is many years younger than me," he thought, "but she is old enough to make her own decisions. He is a gentleman, and though he is not perhaps her equal in fortune, he is a man of sense and honour, and I have nothing against him. I do not doubt that they love each other, and love is the best basis for marriage." Reader, this is not a newspaper, consisting of just the same number of words, whether there be any news in it or not. In these pages you will find only the important events, so do not be surprised if sometimes time seems to stand still, and sometimes to fly. We fly now to the time when a fine son was born to Captain and Mrs. Blifil. Though the birth of a son to his dear sister gave great joy to Mr. Allworthy, it did not take away his love for the abandoned child to whom he was now godfather. He continued to visit little Tom at least once a day in his room. Mr. Allworthy suggested to his sister that the two boys be raised together in his house. Mrs. Blifil agreed, but Captain Blifil was not so easily pleased. He liked to use Bible texts to tell Mr. Allworthy that bastard children should be punished. Mr. Allworthy disagreed. He said that however guilty the parents might be, their children were certainly innocent, and God would not punish the innocent. While Captain Blifil was becoming more and more jealous of Mr. Allworthy's love for little Tom, Mrs. Wilkins made a discovery. She believed she now knew the name of Tom's father. My reader may remember that Jenny Jones had lived for some years with a certain schoolmaster. His name was Partridge, and he was a pleasant, humorous fellow, but his wife was not. Perhaps this was because, after 9 years of marriage, she was still childless. Mrs. Partridge, a jealous woman, had chosen Jenny Jones to be her servant because she was plain, and Jenny lived quietly in their house for more than 4 years, doing her work and learning Latin from Mr. Partridge. Then, one day, Mrs. Partridge saw Jenny sitting closely with her husband, studying their books, and suddenly her jealous thoughts began. They were fed by small suspicions, one after another, and soon she lost her temper and ordered Jenny to leave the house. Mr. Partridge, who was afraid of his wife, said nothing, and soon the house was calm again. Mrs. Partridge loved her husband, and she might have forgotten all about it, but some months later she heard news of Jenny from the village gossips. "She's had 2 bastard babies," they said. "Their father must be from here, because it's less than 9 months since she left the village." Mrs. Partridge was shocked, and all her jealousy returned. She was convinced of her husband's guilt, and went straight home. The fight which followed was furious. Mrs. Partridge attacked her husband with tongue, teeth, and hands. Though Partridge did nothing, there was soon blood on both of them. The neighbours came to watch, and soon everyone was saying that Mr. Partridge had beaten his wife most cruelly. The cause of this quarrel was reported in various ways. Some said one thing, others said another, and it was a long time before Mrs. Wilkins heard the true reason. When she did, she told Captain Blifil. The captain told Mr. Allworthy, and Mr. Allworthy sent Mrs. Wilkins to find Mr. Partridge. Though he lived 15 miles away, Mrs. Wilkins went quickly, and brought back the schoolmaster and his wife. Mr. Allworthy began the trial immediately, and it took 3 days. On the first day, Partridge declared his innocence, but his wife gave all the reasons why she thought him guilty. Partridge was silent, until at last he asked Mr. Allworthy to send for Jenny Jones. Mr. Allworthy sent a messenger to get Jenny, who now lived a whole day's journey from his house. On the third day, everyone came to hear Mr. Allworthy's judgment. Unfortunately, the messenger had returned without Jenny. She had left her new home just a few days earlier, in the company of a soldier. Mr. Allworthy's good opinion of Jenny was now lost forever. He listened again to Mrs. Partridge, who now swore she had discovered her husband and Jenny in bed together, and then he found poor Mr. Partridge guilty. Mr. Partridge lost his little school, and soon he lost his wife too, for she died suddenly. Though the villagers now began to feel sorry for him, he decided to go away. Although Mr. Allworthy had punished the father, he grew fonder of little Tommy. This did not please Captain Blifil, who saw every example of Mr. Allworthy's generosity to others as his own loss. The captain's greatest pleasure was planning what to do with Mr. Allworthy's wealth. He fully expected Mr. Allworthy to die soon, leaving his wealth to his sister's son. The captain wanted to make great changes to the house and park, and he spent many hours reading about architecture and gardening. But fortune was unkind to him. The unlucky captain died first, of a sudden and unexpected accident. Chapter 3. Young Tom causes some anxiety. The reader will not be surprised if we pass quickly over 12 years, when nothing interesting happened. We shall now meet our hero, Tom, at about 14 years of age. To be honest, it was the opinion of all Mr. Allworthy's family that young Tom was born to be hanged. Indeed, I am sorry to say, there was too much reason for this. From his earliest years, Tom showed signs of crime. To give 3 examples, he had stolen some apples from a tree, a duck from a farm, and a ball from the pocket of his companion, young Master Blifil. In contrast, the young son of Captain and Mrs. Blifil was praised by all the neighbourhood. He was quiet and good, and many people wondered why Mr. Allworthy allowed his nephew to be educated with such a bad influence as Tom. Yet Tom, bad as he is, must be our hero. So here is a story to help you to get to know him better. About this time, Tom had only one friend among the servants, and this was Mr. Allworthy's gamekeeper, George Seagrim. Some said that Tom learned his bad ways from this man, whose idea of the meaning of yours and mine was rather loose. Indeed, the whole duck and most of the stolen apples were eaten by Black George and his family. One day, young Tom went shooting with the gamekeeper near the edge of Mr. Allworthy's land. They surprised some birds which flew into the neighbour's land. Tom ran after them. The gamekeeper followed him, and they both fired their guns. The neighbour, who was riding nearby, heard the gunfire and came to look. He caught Tom with a dead bird, but he didn't find the gamekeeper, who was hiding in the trees. When he returned home, Tom admitted his crime to Mr. Allworthy, but he insisted that he had been shooting alone. The gamekeeper was sent for, but he too denied being with Tom that afternoon. Mr. Allworthy sent Tom to bed, and next morning he called him back and asked the same questions. Tom gave the same answers, even when he was whipped. At last, Mr. Allworthy believed Tom was telling the truth. He apologized and gave Tom a little horse as a present. "Oh, sir," Tom said, "you are too good to me." He very nearly told Mr. Allworthy the truth, but then he remembered the gamekeeper and was silent. He felt very guilty. The thing which put an end to Tom's silence was a fight between himself and Master Blifil. Usually Tom avoided fights with his younger companion because he really loved him, but one day, as they played together, Blifil called Tom a poor bastard. Tom immediately jumped on Blifil, and the result was a bloody nose. Blifil ran to his uncle to complain. Tom told Mr. Allworthy what Blifil had called him, but young Blifil said, "He is lying, uncle, the same way as he lied when he said nobody was with him when he shot the bird. Black George, the gamekeeper, was there, Tom confessed it to me." "Is this true, child?" asked Mr. Allworthy. "Why did you lie to me about it?"